Wonderful. Jesus makes it right. Thank you so much. Well, this morning we're going to be looking at Mark chapter 5. And so you can turn in your Bibles or follow up on the screen. We're going to read beginning from verse 1 in Mark 5. Hear the word of the Lord. This is Jesus and the disciples, they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when that's Jesus, when he had stepped out of the boat, immediately a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him any more, even with the chain. For he had often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him. And he shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he had said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." He begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now there on the hillside a great herd of swine was feeding. And the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us into the swine, let us enter them." So he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea, and were drowned in the sea. The swineherds ran off and told it in the city and in the country. Then people came to see what it was that had happened. They came to Jesus and saw the demoniac sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had the legion. And they were afraid. Those who had seen what had happened to the demoniac and to the swine reported it. And then they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by demons begged him that he might be with him. But Jesus refused and said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, many of you, some of you probably know, or you might know it even better, what story comes right before this interesting story that we just read in the Gospel of Mark. Before the disciples and Jesus bring their boat to the shore, before they end up running ashore in the midst of this graveyard, essentially, they have just been through something out on the ocean. They were all together out on a boat, on this sea, and the wind started to pick up and a storm began. And in the midst of this storm, the disciples were undoubtedly remembering all of the stories that they had heard of people who had died and drowned on this very sea. Their thoughts are immediately going to ideas of death by drowning. The storm picks up more and more, and the boat begins to sink. Immediately, all of the disciples spring into action. Everyone is doing everything that they possibly can to save the boat from drowning. They're bailing. They're looking around for any way out. This is undoubtedly one of the most terrifying moments of their life. And all this time, they're trying to figure Jesus Christ out. It's still early in the Gospel of Mark, and they still have questions, some questions anyway, about who this man Jesus is. And so in the midst of this storm, this terrifying moment, they look around and they find Jesus sleeping. And so they're trying to figure him out, and whatever they might think of Jesus about who he is and what he came to do, he's definitely not making a good impression right then. But they ask him to help. And they're in this terrified moment in this storm, but when Jesus stands up, they become afraid of something else. Because Jesus stands up and he tells the wind, he speaks to the wind, he speaks to the waves. He actually gives a command to the storm to stop. And as the disciples are watching this, the storm just stops. And so the disciples were terrified of this storm, but now they are wondering, who the heck is this person that they're in the boat with? And they become more afraid of him. In the story, they don't even talk to him. They just talk to one another. They say to one another, who then is this, that even the wind and the waves obey him? It's a terrifying moment for them, and it grows. Concern turns to anxiety. Anxiety turns to fear as they're in the midst of this really horrific experience. But now, as we read in Mark 5, verse 1, it's over. Thank goodness. They have now come to the ground where it's safe. So now maybe they have the opportunity to think a little bit about what has been happening. Maybe they can consider and process what happened out on the storm, maybe talk with one another a little bit, maybe ask Jesus some questions about what happened, but have some downtime to relax from this event that they have just gone through. But I wonder, as they step off the boat onto this beach, I wonder which disciple it is who notices first that their horror story, their thriller of a story, is not over. The disciples gather on the shore, they step out of the boat, and the shore is not a pretty place. The wind is still howling, and there are these ragged and windswept limestone hills all around them. And in the moonlight, these hills make shadows that dance around and maybe play tricks with their eyes. The storm at this point is let up completely, but the ground is still wet and everything is eerie. And then they notice where they are. It's a graveyard. They recognize that there are tombs throughout the hills, caves and hollows that are used for the dead. They've run aground from one nightmare onto another. First century people believed that demons lived near the tombs. They also believed that demons were more active at night. And so here they are in this creepy setting, wondering about the tombs, the shadows, trying to find the quickest way to get out. And then Jesus, who they are still pretty unsure of, we have to remember that, steps out of the boat, and then they hear it. Right out of the tombs comes a screaming madman full of demons. He's dragging a chain behind himself. He has broken shackles on his hands and his feet. He's naked. He's covered with bruises and scrapes. He's probably bleeding freely from the most recent of the injuries, right? I mean, this is the ultimate you think it's over, but it's not kind of moment. We're used to seeing things like this in movies, in thrillers and horror movies all the time, where you think they've won, but then they haven't. I don't know how many of you will resonate with this, but I bet some of you will. But I think when I read this story, I actually think of the Terminator series with Arnold Schwarzenegger. You know, you've got the good guys trying to defeat a bad, evil robot, and it just keeps coming back. And you keep thinking that the movie is over, that they've done everything they can, and phew, that was a great movie, it's over, but then the robot gets back up, and it's not over. That's what the disciples are going through. The demons in this man confront Jesus immediately. The disciples were so grateful that they're on the shore now. Their horror experience out on the shore, out on the sea is over, but now they would give anything to be back out on the boat again, out on the water where it's safe. Following Jesus is just not turning out the way they expected. That's the setting of our text. Fear upon fear. The disciples trying to figure out who Jesus is, and they're learning more and more about him, even if the things that they learn aren't at all what they expect. And so these demons confront Jesus. And when that happens, the disciples are terrified yet again. So this hopeless man from the tombs, lost to circumstances, he's controlled beyond his ability to cope. He yells at Jesus, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" You know, this doesn't actually sound that different from the question the disciples asked one another in the boat. "Who then is this? What have you to do with me?" they ask. The disciples expect a big power struggle. But instead of this battle that they might be expecting, the demon just starts to beg Jesus for mercy. And instantly the whole mood of the passage changes. We discover in the story that Jesus has already commanded the demons to leave. The battle that the disciples have been bracing themselves for never happens. It's over before it even began. And as I said, they just beg Jesus for mercy. For some reason now, these demons, these particular demons at least, want to stay in this region. They want to stay in this country. There's something about their location that is desirable to them, and it's clear that they seem to need some kind of host. Maybe it is that they don't want to float around freely or something like that. But this kind of behavior was absolutely in line with first century belief in demons. But even so, even with that, what happens next in the passage of Scripture has got to be one of the weirdest things that happens in all of the Bible. Just when the disciples are breathing this sigh of relief, just when they think that they can relax now that all of that is over, the pigs get involved. Now, there's this huge group of pigs nearby, and for some reason, Jesus commands these demons to enter this group of pigs. Now, there are, in fact, about 2,000 of these pigs, and they all get possessed by these demons, and they start running toward the sea. It's clear in the text, we don't completely understand this, but it's clear in the text that this is an act of mercy on Jesus' part. We may not exactly know why in our 21st century minds. We don't track with that, but it does demonstrate mercy. We can tell that from the way the text is written. Mercy perhaps even to the demons themselves, which is another thing we might not quite track. But now, we're in a different kind of movie, aren't we? We were in kind of a horror movie that transitioned to a thriller, but now we're in Attack of the Demon-Possessed Pigs, or something like that. 2,000 screaming pigs suddenly race down the countryside, and they fling themselves into the sea, and they all perish instantly. They make a sacrifice, in a sense, to save this possessed man. The man is cleansed, saved from his demon possession, when absolutely no one in the world could help this man. Off of this boat steps the one person who has come into the world who can actually help him. Jesus removes the spiritual shackles that these demons have on this man, and he sets him free, and he casts these demons into these pigs who then instantly drown themselves. It's bizarre, but amazing. When there was no one who could help, along comes Jesus. The disciples probably wish that this miracle could have happened in maybe a nicer, tidier, cleaner kind of way. But it is impressive nonetheless. But does it fit into the disciples' previous understanding of who Jesus is? Probably not. This is probably a surprise. And then next in the story, we learn that there are some other people around too. And if the man who was the demoniac, if this man was rejoicing that he's been set free, and if the disciples are just kind of scratching their heads wondering who Jesus is, they're kind of in wonder and confusion, then these other people who are present in the story are not pleased at all, because the pigs belonged to them. How much do you think 2,000 pigs were worth? to first century people. I mean, we are undoubtedly talking about the livelihood of many people, if not probably the entire nearby town. And so these swine herders run off to get help. For them, this experience has been a nightmare of completely another sort. What a financial disaster. The disciples, they're now standing in the midst of a scene that they, I'm sure, have never quite imagined. It's still dark. The odd-shaped shadows from these jagged hills in the moonlight dance around the group. A naked, bleeding man stands before them in confused relief. And now there are 2,000 dead pig corpses washing up on the shore. Word of this sort of thing tends to get out. At first, the disciples can hear murmuring of voices, but slowly it grows louder and louder when suddenly up over the nearest rise, torches appear, and a crowd of people from the town comes toward them. The swineherders have gotten help. Now, the few disciples that probably haven't already gotten back in the boat are probably making their way now, trying to make a quick escape. But the first thing this crowd notices is surely the pig corpses littered throughout the beach, bobbing up and down in the water maybe. But then they stop because they notice the demon-possessed man. We can imagine the conversation they had. Isn't this the guy we chained up? They ask one another. Isn't he the one who would attack people and he bruised himself? He was insane and he wouldn't keep his clothes on. Yeah, I remember him. I was afraid to come here when he was out and about among the tombs. It wasn't safe to be around here with him around. I remember when people tried to help him, but nobody really could. They couldn't do anything, and look at him now. The man, we read in the text, is now sitting quietly and at peace. And by the end of the story, he is wearing clothes, and he looks totally normal. Obviously, his life has changed, and the crowd realizes this immediately. But they wonder, don't they? What would it take to do that? Who could possibly save someone like that? And what about the pigs? What kind of man could cause that to happen? 2,000 pigs at once. The crowd begins to slow, and then they survey the scene once more. And I'm certain as they do that, many of them began backing away. Mark tells us that they became afraid. When you run across Jesus Christ, you just can't be sure what's going to happen. So what will they do, this crowd? Will they be amazed by Jesus' power? Will they thank Jesus for saving the man, many of whom they probably know him well? In fact, some of them might even be his relatives from this town. Will they ask Jesus to teach them? Will they ask Jesus maybe to heal more people? They could have had any number of responses to Jesus, but instead they ask him, in fact, the text says they beg him to leave. They probably can't afford to lose any more pigs. Or they're just, and in addition, they're just not willing to find out what has happened. The sensible thing to do is to get this guy and his little group out of here as soon as possible. Now, they're not going to force him because they are way too afraid for that. But please leave us alone. They beg him. And so Jesus gets back in the boat. But one person has a different response. It's the man, of course. He doesn't want Jesus to leave. But if Jesus has to leave, then he wants to go with him. Take me with you, he begs. Is it possible that he knows who Jesus is? The disciples are only just beginning to figure it out. They're not there yet. The crowd doesn't want to know. They just want this nightmare to end. But you'll remember that the legion of demons in this man was actually the only group in this story that correctly identified Jesus Christ. They called him Jesus, Son of the Most High God. Does this man remember that? Does he retain some of that somehow? Or is this man just so grateful because Jesus saved his life when no one else could? Is he grateful that Jesus values him more than the financial worth of a herd of pigs? Or is he just amazed? Is he just convinced that wherever Jesus goes, boy, he just wants to go with him too. And so he begs Jesus, I want to be with you. That is the response that's good. Everyone's trying to understand Jesus, but only this guy gets it right. Jesus comes into lives. He comes into our lives too, and he just turns everything upside down. When we encounter Jesus Christ, it's never what we expect. But when Jesus shows us mercy, and he does, he shows us mercy every day. What is our response? Do we say, go away, leave us alone? Do we shrink back from him in fear? Do we sit on the sidelines trying to figure out exactly what we can expect from Jesus in the future? Do we crawl back into the boat when no one is looking? Or do we say with this man, I want to be with you? When we think we know all there is to know about Jesus Christ, when we think that we are doing just fine, Jesus comes into our lives again. And we're surprised. No matter how spiritually mature we are, or no matter how spiritually mature we think we are, we can all safely say that our understanding of Jesus Christ is too limited. It is too boxed in. Would the Jesus you know seem like the main character in a thriller movie just like that, with the demons and the angry crowd and the dark and creepy night and the tombs and the pigs? When Jesus does something like that we did not expect at all, how do we respond to that? Fear, confusion, self-protection? Or do we just embrace the opportunity to know Jesus more and more? Well, that's what the man does. And so Jesus tells him, go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you. Amen. Let's stand and sing together.